So for all those who just joined, so I think we're going to start about right now. Okay. Can everyone see my screen? Someone? Do we all see the screen? Okay. So to start, we're going to be learning about Worcester v. Virginia. This is going to be the story of Indigenous American rights, because this was very important in starting to really codify and started to talk about Indigenous autonomy within the United States. Okay, so because this is our first class, we're going to start with some aims and really talk about what we're going to be learning about and how we're going to go about that. So first of all, we're going to learn about this, how the Supreme Court, functions, how it came to be and why we have a Supreme Court in the first place. We're also going to learn about the basics of how we interpret and read into Supreme Court cases, because they are more important than just deciding what the ruling of the case actually is. They have a precedent. We're going to talk about what that means later. We're going to kind of start equating ourselves with the fact that we're just going to start learning about the facts of the cases and how important that is. And because Supreme Court cases are so fundamental to, the way our American society and American government functions, we're going to be looking at the modern day implications that this Supreme Court case particularly has, and also for the other Supreme Court cases that we're going to be covering within this course. We're also going to have a class discussion or debate. It's just really going to be fluid about the majority versus dissenting opinions. Again, it's not high pressure. We're just going to have, a general conversation about that. And we're also going to talk generally about the possible current events that pertain to this case, which will link pretty well with the modern day implications. And let's talk about but what does Supreme Court case do? That's just a really broad thing that we just need to cover, when catalyzing this lesson in course. So the background of the Supreme Court case. So one thing to understand from the get-go is that the framers wanted to create 3 branches of government, of the federal government. And this was an ideology that they studied when, looking at ancient Greek and Roman literature and their foundations of their democracy and government. Because modern governments, they couldn't really look for examples that were really working, because back then they had Great Britain, which was not really working for the colonies at that point, as much as you probably know. France was going through its own revolution with monarchy. So they really had to go back in ancient times to really look for an example to, start erecting a new form of government, which they're looking for at this time. And of those 3 branches of government, some of you might already know this, but just to reiterate, the legislative branch was both houses of Congress. So the House of Representatives and Senate is encapsulated within that branch. We also have the executive branch, which think about the White House, all the executive agencies. So, the U.S. Postal Service, that's an agency that's run in the executive branch. That's been in the news kind of circulating around. So you might recognize that. We also have the judicial branch. And this is essentially the Supreme Court and all the other different federal, municipal courts and the lower courts. So the state Supreme Courts. And, there's a hierarchy. I mean, if you go downtown in your own respective cities, you might see a county court, that's going to be a part of that. And another really important ideology is separation of powers and checks and balances. So this was essentially to kind of assuage, all the tyranny that they were facing at the hands of the British colonial government back in the, late 1700s when we started to craft our Constitution. And King George III had no concept of separation of powers because it was a tyrannical government back then. It was not a good government, essentially, is what I'm saying. And what separation of powers means is that each of these branches of government are going to be separate, and they cannot just be ruled by, for example, the executive branch with the president. The president can't just control all the government. There are separations and there are limitations to the powers that each branch has, which is what checks and balances is. So for example, the judicial branch, and we're going to talk about this later, through their decisions can say, hey, president in the executive branch, or congressperson in the legislative branch, we're going to control your actions to make sure we don't have any more tyranny. And that's a very important and principal concept when we're going into this course. So just, keep in mind about the different powers and the checks and balances that each branch has respectively. And some of you might know this and some of you might not, but during the ratification of the Constitution, because, when we wrote the Constitution back in the late 1700s, it needed to be ratified or needed to be approved by the colonies, or almost the states, the 13 original colonies that you might be familiar with. And to try to make sure that the Constitution would be ratified, because there were opponents to the Constitution at that time. They had Federalist Papers, which essentially just, tried to solidify their own viewpoints to the public that would be later kind of ratifying the Constitution in the respective states, because they did need 9 out of the 13 states in order to ratify the new Constitution. In order to get those votes and kind of explain, how the new Constitution would work and prevent against the tyranny that almost every single American individual was much so familiar with at that time, they wrote in Federalist number 78, so the 78th, opinion piece of paper that would be circulating at that time. They basically just advocated for a principle called judicial review, which is going to be important when we're talking about Supreme Court cases, because it argues that, as you can see probably illuminated on this board better, it argues that the Supreme Court can rule against an action of, Congress or of the president. So for example, if Congress passed an unconstitutional law or like a bad law that goes against the foundations of the Constitution, or let's say that the president is doing something way out of their power limits, going back to separation of powers and checks and balances. This is a check and balance, as in the Supreme Court or the judicial branch has the ability to say, no, this is not okay. This is not right. We cannot have this in our nation. And it's a very important power, and it's going to be a power later defined in other Supreme Court cases that we're going to talk about in this course. But it's a very, very, very important principle to keep in mind, that this is a power that it can strike down laws either at the state level or at the national, federal level, and this must be abided, regardless of the circumstances. Okay, so more background on the Supreme Court is that we tend to have 9 justices on the Supreme Court. Well, in the Constitution, there's nothing really that strictly codifies like the numbers of Supreme Court justices that we need to have. It's kind of fluctuated throughout history, but in the late 1800s, after President Andrew Jackson, that kind of triggered a whole myriad of different responses, limiting to 7 or maybe 10 Supreme Court justices, but that's just a story that we don't really need to get into, and it's just long and really not important. But currently, just, so you can understand the Supreme Court case now, the chief Justice of the United States, so think about this as a chopped Supreme Court case justice, some of you might know, is John J. G. Roberts Jr. So Chief Justice Roberts, which is going to be a very important name to just know when you're reading the news or whatnot. Clarence Thomas and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Stephen G. Bayer, Samuel A. Abitolo, Sonia Sotomayor, and it goes on. And then the recent Supreme Court appointees to the Supreme Court in the Trump administration, it will be Gorsuch and Kavanaugh. Most of you probably have heard of Kavanaugh in the last few years or so during Trump's tenure. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're knowing who's on the Supreme Court. So the president has actually the power to appoint justices of the Supreme Court, although it has to go through the Senate and it has to be confirmed by the Senate. And as most of you know, the Senate is now ruled by Republicans who want to support Trump. And that's why we saw Gorsuch and Kavanaugh go straight through Senate in the way that they did. So more background to know about the Supreme Court is what kind of cases does it hear, and how would a Supreme Court case really just come about in the first place. So in Article 3, Section 2, so Article 3 talks about the Supreme Court and the judicial branch, as we talked about earlier. In Section 2 of that article of the Constitution, it basically distributes the judicial power to different, municipal courts, and saying that there's going to be a hierarchy that's going to be established by Congress. It also says that it has appellate and original jurisdiction, which essentially means that, well, appellate jurisdiction just means that you have to go through the different levels of the court. So you have to go to your local court, and that decision, you can appeal it to maybe the state Supreme Court, and then to your circuit court, which is going to be in broader areas of the US, depending on where you live. And you can appeal those decisions if you don't necessarily like it. And then it can eventually lead to the Supreme Court for it to be decided. But that's, it doesn't necessarily have to go to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court can decide not to take it. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later, about whether or not it can take a case or not. But that's generally how, many decisions that come up, it just doesn't go straight to the Supreme Court. It has to go through other courts, lower courts, as we call it, beforehand. And another concept is original jurisdiction, which is also a principle codified by the Constitution. And basically it just means that when you're dealing with cases regarding ambassadors, because they're not citizens of the US, including their children, they're not citizens of the US. So if it's, or like high-ranking ministers, or if it's just something regarding conflicts between states, there are many Supreme Court cases that we're going to address in future lessons that kind of, go under that, facet of the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. Those will originate in the Supreme Court. Those will go directly. It doesn't have to go through the lower courts. That will start at the Supreme Court and be decided at the Supreme Court, and it will be done in the Supreme Court solely and utterly. So more background on the Supreme Court. We have writs of certiorari. Basically what these are, some of you might have heard about it, but if, as I said about the appellate jurisdiction, if the parties are not necessarily satisfied with the decisions of lower courts, you can take it up to the Supreme Court, and you can basically just, put your plea up, and then the Supreme Court, out of 4 out of the 9 justices, can decide whether or not to take this writ. And most of the time that these cases will be kind of reflective of a bigger issue. If we go to Brown v. Board of Education, which is another case we're going to address later in a different course, in a different class, where it basically, there was multiple cases that were going to decide the same exact issue, but they chose one Supreme Court case that will decide it and set precedent for all the other Supreme Court cases. And that's mostly what they will take, or maybe if it's just of very high caliber and very important to, you know, America at that time for it to be decided on, the Supreme Court case will take it under those specific circumstances. So another part of Supreme Court decisions are the opinions. So normally there's a majority opinion and the dissenting opinions. Basically what a dissenting opinion is, you know, you're disagreeing with the majority opinion. So basically, let's say your decision is 5-4, you know, when those four people, those four justices that disagreed with the majority opinion that basically ruled the case, they will write their dissenting opinion. That will be published. That could be used in other majority opinions even also. Like there's going to be other examples that we're going to talk about where the dissenting opinion in one case could end up being majority opinion in another case. So these are important to be published and very important to be, you know, spread out to the public to read and to comprehend and study. And the majority opinion is going to be led by one Supreme Court case, one justice. Same thing with the dissenting opinion. It's going to be written and, you know, other justices are going to join in with their opinion that they're going to write and kind of show to the public. Same thing with the majority opinion. There's going to be one justice who's just going to write, you know, their opinion and just going to, you know, set the groundwork and kind of set all the different opinions for that one decision. And also another component of a Supreme Court case that we'll address later is the federal question or questions. Sometimes there's multiple. Basically, what is the question that they're addressing? So for example, it's going to be more broad. It's going to be about, well, is this law unconstitutional? How are we going to define this one section in the Constitution? Because a lot of Supreme Court cases set precedent or they define in conjunction with that a certain ambiguous part of the Constitution, and that's going to be one question that, you know, addresses that wholly. So let's talk about the case Worcester v. Georgia, excuse me. So what exactly happened? What are the facts of the case? So just to set kind of a groundwork for everything that was happening at that time, during the 1820s to 1830s, something called Manifest Destiny was happening, where we were expanding eastward, because for much of American history, we lived in the 13 original colonies, now states, but we were trying to move westward and expanding, you know, our fundamental American ideas. However you can construe that, you can say that's colonialism or whatever your opinions are on that. You know, that's something that you either have or will address in your history classes. So this idea of Manifest Destiny was transpiring, and Georgia, a state, an entity that was, you know, on the eastern coast, on the eastern part of the US, they wanted to start expanding and they wanted to go on to native territory, because at that time, all of the West, you know, think about west of the Mississippi River, that was all indigenous land for the most part. So they wanted to start taking and dismantling Native American land, tribal land. So just to put that into perspective, that's one thing that is very important to address. So basically Worcester, along with the American Board, are, just think about them as missionaries that are on Native American land, and they're trying to help them gain sovereignty from Georgia and other state entities that are trying to encroach and take away their land. Okay, and they are also federally protected. They are missionaries under federal jurisdiction. So the federal government is okaying everything that they're doing. And that's something that Georgia did not like. Georgia did not like the fact that these people were on Native American land trying to convince Native Americans to stand up against Georgia and other states trying to encroach on Cherokee, this is like the specific tribe, their land. They did not want that happening in Georgia. But they also had federal protection. So essentially what Georgia did was that they passed a law in 1830 that basically said that Worcester and all of his missionaries or any other white person cannot be on Native American land without, advocating for an oath of support to the state, or without paying a certain fine to do so. And Worcester did not want to do that. He believed that this law was unconstitutional. And I'm going to talk about why he believed that was unconstitutional in a little bit. So essentially what he did is he took this case to, the state Supreme Court and also different lower, more provincial courts that were not the Supreme Court, because, appellate jurisdiction, you have to go in order of the different levels of the courts to eventually write your writ to get attention by the Supreme Court. So there was two cases that led up and that preceded the Worcester v. Virginia case that we're talking about right now. And that was Georgia v. Tassel and Cherokee Nation v. Georgia in 1831. These cases, they did not rule in favor of Worcester or any of those people who were later incarcerated because they violated that 1830 law. Sorry if I didn't mention that earlier, that was kind of important. So basically that transpired and their case later went up to the Supreme Court. But why did he think that it was unconstitutional for this Georgia law to extricate them from indigenous land when they were under federal protection? Why do you think that they thought that? Well, I'm going to tell you why. Because in the Constitution, there is a clause that essentially says that Congress has a sole power to regulate commerce with the various Indian tribes, as it's written in the Constitution, or these indigenous nations, as better put. Along with that, states are not allowed to interfere with the or kind of alter the obligations of these treaties or of these compacts or of these regulations that are made between the federal government and these independent Native American tribes. We can think about it that these Native American people were not viewed as citizens of their respective states. They were viewed as an independent entity, independent nation, if you will, of their tribe. So the Cherokee people are not Georgians. They are not under state, authority. So because there was an 1802 law set up by Congress, set up by the federal government, that was appropriate under the Constitution itself, that basically said, hey, Cherokee Nation, and they did this with other nations too, but this is specific to this case, you are independent and you are sovereign, meaning that they are not under jurisdiction of the Georgia government. They are not under jurisdiction of any other entity except for the federal government, and they will work solely with the federal government, not any state. But because this 1830 Georgia law was interfering with the sovereignty of this nation to allow people of this other state to live and exist within its borders, and because it was putting regulations on what the Cherokee people can do and who can allow on their territory and their land, Worcester, in tandem with the 11 other people who were arrested, but it was mostly him kind of advocating for it, along with the American Board, which was like this whole missionary thing that we talked about earlier in the previous slides. They basically said, okay, this is unconstitutional. We're going to take this up to different levels of courts. And that's led to those two cases that basically went against Georgia and sided, not Georgia, Worcester, and they sided with Georgia in those case rulings. He got a writ that went into Supreme Court case, as a Supreme Court case. But Georgia as it went into the Supreme Court case, Georgia, up to the Supreme Court, excuse me, Georgia refused to take party due to their staunch belief that the United States Supreme Court had no jurisdiction over the matter, which it did. That was kind of a negligible argument to make. So just a quick question, just to check everyone's knowledge. Can someone unmute themselves and answer what kind of jurisdiction would this case fall under? Would it be original jurisdiction or appellate jurisdiction based on our understandings of what that is? Can someone unmute themselves and answer that question? Or not? Ellie H, could you answer the question for the class? Could you unmute yourself and answer or not? Okay, so it is actually appellate jurisdiction because it didn't go straight to the Supreme Court. It had to go to lower courts first. So the federal question, as we talked about, each Supreme Court case of this federal question was, does the state of Georgia have the authority to regulate the intercourse between citizens of its state and the members of the Cherokee Nation? Okay, and the decision ended up siding with Worcester and his party in a 5-1 decision. Interestingly enough, there was actually 6 people at the Supreme Court case back then. That changed obviously now, so that's just like a little thing to keep in your mind, that the 9-person Supreme Court is a fairly new and modern thing. So just to keep that in mind. Just to reiterate, it's cited for all the reasons that Worcester advocated for. He said that the treaties and laws of the United States contemplate the Indian territory as completely separate from that of the states and provide that all intercourse with them shall be carried on exclusively by the government of the Union. Chief Justice Marshall argued, the Cherokee Nation then is a distinct community occupying its own territory in which the laws of the Georgia can have no force. The whole intercourse between the United States and this nation is, by our Constitution and laws, vested in the government of the United States. Because of the Supreme Court ruling, keep in mind that the Supreme Court is like the top court of the United States. Okay, it's going to be solving ideological, understandings such as indigenous autonomy. It's basically just saying it's not only to strike down the Georgia Act, but it's saying like for all the generations of Americans, it's saying that the Cherokee Nation, along with any other Native American nation too, because the Cherokee Nation can be a supplement for the Lakota people or the Chickasaw people. It doesn't really matter if it's Cherokee. It's saying that all indigenous people and all indigenous nations are sovereign, meaning that they are independent and that they're own people, and that it cannot be interfered with or by any laws of states. And it can only be, kind of interfered with or interacted with by the federal government itself, not local government, not state governments. So just, having that in mind. And the dissenting opinion, really, it was not substantive. It really didn't disagree with that principle. It just disagreed about, okay, this shouldn't have been a Supreme Court case because it wasn't following the strict regulations and, the kind of nits and grits of how Supreme Court cases should come to be. It's really, it was done by Justice Baldwin, and it basically just said it was based merely on the procedural defaults in the case, such as a case coming to the Supreme Court as a writ of error, rather than another form of petition like a writ of chanterone. It really doesn't make a much difference, but he said otherwise he kind of agreed with it. So the dissenting opinion, normally it's more impactful and more about the ideologies, about, why it should be the other way. But this was just kind of insignificant. It was just, as I said, the nuts and bolts of Supreme Court cases wasn't really important. So current events, this is going to be a more exciting part of the lectures, is that Trump, as many of you might know, might have read or heard on the news, that President Trump had a rally at Mount Rushmore, the famous American, landmark with all those heads of the past presidents like George Washington and all those fun people. So the controversy kind of started out that by him having a rally at Mount Rushmore, he is saying that, oh, I don't have any regard for the fact that this was built illegally on Native American land. And as we know from that case, Native American tribes, Native American people are sovereign, meaning that they're independent and that you cannot just do whatever you want on Native American land, or as we call it, maybe more colloquially, reservations or whatever. So this actually took place on the Great Sioux Reservation, which is a Native American people, the Sioux people. And it was illegal, and it was a slap in the face because this was happening on the Black Hills, which was this very sacred place for Native people. So by President Trump, having a rally on this area, he was saying, oh, I don't really have a regard for Native peoples or their autonomy. And it was just, it wasn't, it was just more ideological. It was like a slap in the face to many people, especially the Sioux people of this area. So can someone talk to me about their own, beliefs on this issue about, should Trump have had his rally at Mount Rushmore? Do you think it means anything? Do you think we should look into it? What does this say about Indigenous autonomy? Does anyone want to speak on that or have any opinions on that matter? Does anyone want to say anything? Okay. Okay. So for our class discussion, I'm going to just break everyone up into two groups, or if you just want to choose your group on your own, and kind of take around 5 minutes or so. Really kind of just depends on when everyone comes back. And just like make like a few just of your own opinions, just some bullet points, maybe look it up, just about your opinions on the decision. Do you agree with it? And I was, most of the time we're going to have one about, okay, 5 people, half of the class are going to do their own research and kind of defend the majority opinion, and the other half of the class are going to take the time to come up with contentions for the dissenting opinion. But because the dissenting opinion really doesn't hold any substance, maybe everyone can just come back to their own kind of agreements or disagreements with whether or not, we should have Indigenous autonomy, whether or not states should be able to control the actions of Native Americans on the reservations. So if everyone can kind of like take that time and then can share with the class kind of their own viewpoints on the issues. Okay.
Is this about like the Trump, like the news, or is it about the?
It can be about anything. Like you can just share like, oh, this is more broadly about like Indigenous autonomy. So if you can be like, oh, should Trump be able to like have, the rally on Indigenous land, or like, should we even have it like the Mount Rushmore kind of like on Indigenous land in the first place? Just like any perspectives you have on Indigenous autonomy, whether it relates to the current event or not.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm. does everyone need more time, or is this like, kind of coming to an end with like independent research? Or I'll just give everyone like 2 more minutes and then we can share. Everyone's so quiet. Okay, so now that has been roughly 5 minutes. Does anyone want to go ahead and share, kind of their opinions? It doesn't really have to be a debate, mostly because there's not really like two sides to the argument with dissenting majority opinions. But I mean, maybe there could be. You could have a differing opinion that doesn't, align with the majority. So if anyone wants to share their thoughts about either the current events or, even the case itself, just, go on right ahead.
Like I kind of read about like the history of like Americans with like these Native Americans, and I read that like in 1830, like natives were forced from their own homes under the Indian Removal Act. So they basically, I think it was Andrew Jackson, but like he basically um exchanged them land near the Mississippi River in exchange of their like houses and like where they used to live. And only until like 1968 did the Indian Civil Rights Act like happen and gave the natives like more benefits. I also looked into like the Mount Rushmore thing, and it said that I think there was like a thing signed before that gave the Native Americans the right um to like kind of own this land, because like the sacred place, it was a really special spot for them. So like the government did like give them right to have this as their own like sacred land. But I think there was like a gold rush or something, and then just after that, like Americans would like invade into their like space as well. So I feel like it's kind of been like a long term type of situation, and I feel like the Native Americans deserve more and that they should have their own say into like what they think of these Americans like just taking over their land kind of. So that's
Yeah,
kind of, yeah.
that's good. Like you like mentioned all like the Trail of Tears and whatnot, all the tragedies that happened to especially, the eastern bands of the Cherokee and also the Chickasaw,
Mhm.
and their removal. That was really insightful. Thank you. Um, does anyone else want to share their opinions on the matter? Um, Sophia, do you want to share your opinions on Indigenous sovereignty? Richard, do you want to share some insight? Okay, and a very important part of this class is just trying to like have a dialogue about very important issues that are happening in society and how it relates to, the Supreme Court more broadly. So, I mean, maybe next time you'll be more prepared, to talk about these issues um, and have a more kind of general discussion. Does anyone want to share anything? Okay, so no work is needed for the next class, but we can just sit here and I'll talk about some more issues and just wait for some people to, you know, talk about different issues that are happening. Okay. So for example, around the Mount Rushmore issue, there was a $20 million suit that kind of happened recently, and that's been kind of going on. And that amount of money has been actually accumulating. That will be going to the Sioux people whose land was taken away by, Mount Rushmore and having that sacred land kind of just obstructed and taken away from them with putting, that all those faces of those presidents on. So but the Native American people, they really don't want that money. They have repeatedly declined that, even though it has been surmounting, and that amount of money has been accumulating and added more to kind of like just put the issue besides them. But what they're advocating for is they're saying that you, as America, you cannot just disregard a treaty that transpired. Okay. They're saying that, there was a treaty that was put in place that was mentioned by the person that was just sharing. And you have to really make sure that the federal government is, living up to everything that it was expecting and anticipating. So, and that was just a very important aspect that I think that was lost in the process and kind of the loss of the process of colonization and the manifest destiny principle that we talked about earlier. And we really need to, as a society, kind of shift away from, these principles of, silencing Native American people, silencing their voice, either just as people, as rights as Americans, but also constitutionally when we made a Supreme Court case that codified Indigenous autonomy, because the Supreme Court case will set a precedent, meaning that whatever their president will do, whatever the decision is, that this will transcend generations and that you cannot disregard this whatsoever for any reason, because this is now law of the land. And you legally and constitutionally cannot be doing the things that the federal government has been doing. And that's an issue that I think that we as Americans and that we as a society, we need to address and we need to remedy and we need to fix more wholly. Um, and that's my own stance on the issue as it relates to modern day examples. I'm sure there are other, more relevant instances of disregarding indigenous autonomy. For example, with the pipeline going through sacred Native American burial ground, that is totally disregarding their rights to their land, because you have to think about it. Indigenous tribes are just not, maybe a city or just like kind of a little different part of a state or whatever. They're not their own little provincial thing, but they are separate entities. They are separate nations almost that can only be regulated by the federal government. And the fact that they're putting a pipeline through this sacred land is not only just, it makes you feel bad on the inside as a person, but it also is illegal. That is not constitutional. That is disregarding treaties that were instituted, because treaties made with the federal government cannot be taken back on when the other party, the Native American party, does not have their grievances redressed with the implementation of this pipeline. Okay, so that's just another more, contemporary instance of everything. So that's another important thing to keep in mind. So does anyone okay, have anything else to share? I'm going to check the chat function right now. Sorry, I did not see that. It's embarrassing. Wait, where is it? I'm so bad at technology. Give me a minute. Where is it? Oh my God. Some people were. Okay, so just to kind of redress, so someone said that no, because it's disrespectful for the natives who have a history there. I totally agree with you. And just to reiterate some other points, it's really important and paramount almost to respect not only their place as Native Americans, almost ideologically, but also constitutionally and in law, we need to address that better. Yeah, it's not fair to Native Americans, because it's not fair to just go back on a treaty that a nation kind of posed, that we've codified into law. You don't see the federal government just backing out on trade deals willy-nilly and just, just disregarding the implications it could have on foreign nations, but it's doing that to Native Americans. That's a double standard that we need to really kind of assuage and remedy and address as a nation. Yeah, so Trump should not be doing anything. Sophia just said that Trump shouldn't. That is very disrespectful. Yeah, I have to really agree with you on that one. I think just because it's history, that doesn't mean it's valid or whatever. Yeah, I agree with you on that. But we really have to think that what's more important, our Constitution and the values that it holds, such as the Supreme Court decisions that said that Native Americans are sovereign people, or having a national statue of these presidents. What's more important, our laws as a nation or a monument? We really have to think that and keep that in mind when we're really thinking about these issues. And that's very important to comprehend and to address more wholly. yeah, the monument really isn't important. It's the rights, as you said, it's the rights and our laws as a country that are much more important than anything else. So, I mean, does anyone have more opinions on different issues? I mean, it could be about, like the pipeline that was in the news, maybe a few years back, and it still is. It still is a pressing issue, eminent issue. Does anyone have opinions about that, or maybe even questions about how the Supreme Court cases, work and function? Um, our Supreme Court justice that's very famed and everyone loves is Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and she was just put in the hospital and she was out and then back in. That's going to be kind of scary. I mean, if anyone has opinions on that, we all love her and we don't want to see her go because she's very important for the functioning of our nation. Um, you know, our Supreme Court is kind of in shambles because not to go on a tangent, but the Trump administration has done something called court packing. And if any of you know anything about that, essentially what it is that during an administration, when openings come up in the Supreme Court, because justices serve for life, so when they pass away or when they very rarely resign, you have to put people back in. So when Scalia died, Trump, he went through the procedures, and because the Senate is run by the Republicans, it has a Republican majority. It confirmed all of his appointments, and and they were conservative appointments. And because they were conservative leaning, you can't be outright conservative as Supreme Court justice. You have to be bipartisan, and you have to be, you have to extract yourself from the situation at hand and all the politics. You have to be, moral, and you have to not be affiliated with, partisanship and whatnot. So by him implementing people that are more conservative leaning, such as Kavanaugh and Gorsuch, future cases, such as cases regarding abortion, in the future will be ruled by conservative justices. And that's why it's most scary to have court packing in that way, where you're trying very, very hard to put as many justices into Supreme Court, or even lower more other like federal levels of courts, because Trump can also, with the consent of the Senate, add justices to the circuit courts or whatnot. And if you have more conservative leaning justices, then you're going to have more conservative leaning policies. And that cases like this would be solved in a different way because they're differing ideologies. And Trump was even the first president to have a list when he was going to be appointed for his tenure, for his the entirety duration of his 4-year administration, to have a list of Supreme Court justices that he wanted to appoint. All he said that were very conservative leaning, not outright conservative, because you can't say that, but they were all conservative leaning. And so that's kind of important and kind of different. We never saw that before with a president. So that's kind of interesting, just keeping that in mind for current events purposes when you're reading the news and kind of affiliating yourself with all those issues. But yeah, does anyone else have anything more to say? We have like 2 minutes left. So if we think that we came to a conclusion, I think this was a good way to end it.